Hey there everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Comical Life. As a graphic illustrator, I created the show to help you guys with creating your own comics and explaining certain parts about comics. So, let's get started with this week's topic, manga and comics. As an illustrator, I've done and worked with both styles, but I mainly work in a manga setting. Now some of you may say, but manga and comics are different things. Yes, they are in some ways, but they're also very similar. They are similar to the way that a square is a rectangle, but a rectangle is not a square. In math, a square has to be equal on all sides, but a rectangle has to be equal on opposite sides. So, a manga is a comic, but a comic isn't a manga. And I'll explain this a little more in detail in a bit. So what makes a comic different from Western comics? Well, we'll need to look at the history of both comics and manga. So we'll start with comics. In earliest versions of comics, they were one-panel political or social commentaries in newspapers and visual imageries. But what inspired them? Actually, it was tapestry. Tapestry showed stories, issues, towns' histories, and it was the main form of visual imagery that told a tale in Europe. But what was the earliest versions of manga? Manga began from printmaking with woodcuts, or kiboshis. These 18th century books would have words written around the image, as they were supposed to be a visual play within a book. The words would tell the stories, as the images would be the actors on the play. Another difference is the style of both the early works in comics and the early works in manga. Comics were close to realistic people with their character designs. The characters were a simplified realism, but still had that realistic features. However, in the first manga, known as Mighty Atom, or Astro Boy in the Western world, was created by Osamu Tezuka. Tezuka didn't use a realistic style to create his manga, but he used styles inspired by Walt Disney, especially Mickey Mouse. Tezuka is actually quoted to say that Steamboat Willie inspired him to draw some of his character designs in that cartoony style. But why the name manga? Manga is generally used for describing comics coming out of Japan. But again, why the word manga? Manga is actually the Japanese word for both comics and cartooning. And I could go on about how the word manga came out, how it's pronounced with the kanji that is associated with it, but I'm not going to do that. Although, it would be good practice for my major. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. So manga started out as a cartoony kind of style, but over the years became more realistic in some works. Like take Death Note, for example. It's very similar to realism, but yet it still maintains that simplified cartoony aspect, kind of similar to early like Dick Tracy comics, but it's still in that anime style. However, comics started with realism and turned more cartoony over time. Like yes, DC and Marvel comics are still like very close to that simplified realism, but new American Western comics such as Bones are coming out with more cartoony styles. But if manga was created in or by people from Japan, where are comics from? Well, it is an English term, but it's also our umbrella term for all comics all over the world. But in Japan, their umbrella term is manga. But for Japanese comics and for the rest of the world, we consider them manga. So it is again like that rectangle and square analogy. A manga is a comic, but a comic is not a manga. Well, I guess technically with the way manga is actually the Japanese word for comic, but generally how the world views it, that's not the case. So that's it for this week's episode. Tell me, what are your favorite mangas or comics? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you guys next week.